Welcome to Russian History with Dr. Brovkin. Today I begin a new series of videos devoted to Putin and Russia under Putin. So there'll be several of those, and what I'd like to ask my dear subscribers is, before you watch those, please watch the 3 videos on the 1990s. Russia, it was a time of corruption, the privatization that went askew. It was a time of poverty, of wages not being paid. To answer the question, why Putin and why in 1999? The story begins basically in the summer of 1998. And that is the time when there was a default. So Russia defaulted on its foreign obligations and couldn't pay its bills, and it was basically bankrupt. Now, the background of that story is that what preceded it was a so-called government treasuries scandal. And that was devoted to the fact that Yeltsin's government took a huge loan from IMF, and then knowing that they will receive $5 billion, they started issuing the so-called treasury bills, GPOs, and they were selling them at a very, very high percentage, up to 60% per year, to the favored banks. And so the scandal was that basically this operation was pretty much like stealing money from IMF and giving it to the privileged banks, which means to friends of Yeltsin and his family. And all of that is actually covered quite well. If you're really interested in this story, you could look up the Bank of New York scandal in the literature such as New York Times, and also at the hearings of the U.S. Congress, the Banking Committee, where I actually testified in 1999 about this Bank of New York scandal. But the point for this story is that Russia was bankrupt and a lot of money was stolen. And one of the key players in this whole theft is Yeltsin and his clan or family, which included his closest advisors, and the most important among those is Mr. Berezovsky, who is sometimes called the godfather of the Kremlin. And then there was Chubais, and then there was his Tatiana, his daughter, and there were several others. Now, they controlled a huge chunk of the economy. Just to give you an example, Berezovsky alone controlled the first channel of the TV, which gave him a pretty serious influence on public opinion. And then Yeltsin's husband was the owner of Arafat, the major state company of airplanes. And then Berezovsky himself owned a huge Avtovaz, which is a biggest car manufacturing company in Russia. In other words, advertised assets into their own pockets. Now, the default came in August 1998, and this created a huge political scandal, which Yeltsin had to fire his previous prime minister, Chernomyrdin. For our story, the situation is this. So on the one hand, you have the family as a major political and economic force. And then you have 2 types of opponents. The first type of opponent is the Communist Party. The Communist Party was primarily against privatization, against stealing national resources, against the foreign influence into Russia. And they were, very, very feisty, because they knew they had millions and millions of voters, and they had a huge fraction in the Duma, and they actually were a serious political force. So, in the summer of 1998, communists initiate an impeachment procedure against President Yeltsin. Now, by Russian constitution, this procedure had to go through a very complicated process. You need to have a 2/3 majority in the parliament, which is Duma. You need to have a 2/3 majority in the Federation Council, which pretty much consists of the governors of all Russia's provinces. And on top of it, you had to have the support of the Constitutional Court. The key person behind it, who said he had the required majority of votes, was General Rokhlin. At that same time, he was killed under strange circumstances, and his wife was accused of killing him. But that didn't stop the proceedings for impeachment, and the communists kept on pushing, and theoretically the impeachment proceedings still kept alive for the next year or so. Then the next shot fired by the family clan against Yeltsin's opponents was another very interesting and almost as fascinating a story, was directed against the Supreme Court chair or prosecutor general, Mr. Skuratov. In March 1999, the first television station channel, which belonged to Mr. Berezovsky, published compromising documents that showed Skuratov in the company of two prostitutes, and the video claimed that this is how he spent his time. Now, he denied, of course, this. He claimed it was a fabrication, and there are more and more details that started coming up, and then it was clear that it was Yeltsin and his chief of the presidential administration who was behind this attack on the prosecutor general. Now, the complicated factor was that it is not against the law for a Russian prosecutor general to be entertained by prostitutes, and the law wasn't broken. But the scandal was big enough that Skuratov was forced to retire and to basically leave his post. So it looked like a pretty serious win for the so-called family or Yeltsin's plan. Brings me to opponent number two, a major opposition force other than the communists, and these are so-called the statists or государственники, or people who were for the strong Russian state. They didn't have a political party of their own, but they were basically united by several important issues of the day, a political agenda, if you want. They all were against Yeltsin, against the privatization, against the oligarchs, against Berezovsky, against the theft of national resources by certain clans, groups. In the fall of 1998 comes Primakov, Evgenii Primakov, who is appointed prime minister. Now, the appointment of Primakov is definitely a victory of the statists, is a victory of those who oppose Yeltsin's clan and who are trying to lead a more independent foreign policy course. So it's a very, very important appointment because that is connection to Putin. Appointment of Primakov is a second best for the forces of opposition. And Yeltsin could not appoint anybody who was connected to the communists. This was out of the question. But in order to somehow appoint somebody who is not exactly from his entourage, he appointed Primakov. And Primakov is a very, very respected figure at that time and even now. So many years, he's really a kind of a hero now in retrospect. So who is this Primakov? He comes from, he's a scholar. He was specializing in Middle East and Arab countries. I saw many of his pictures with all the leaders of the Middle East, including Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein and Egyptian presidents and Yasir Arafat and others. So he spoke perfect Arabic. He worked in the Institute of International Relations. His immediate preceding job, and there are two that are very important. He served as a foreign minister under Yeltsin in 96, 98, and he also headed the the intelligence agency. So he had this intelligence connections, and not the KGB, meaning the domestic spying agency, but foreign intelligence. And these are highly respected in Russia at that time, and now as the people who were engaged in promoting Russia's interest overseas. So Primakov comes in as the spokesman of this statist, of these conservative and forces for more independence. Now, one of the fascinating things that Primakov did in this capacity was the so-called affair over the Atlantic, as it's known in history. Basically, in March 1999, Primakov was on the way to the United States to meet Al Gore and President Clinton, and this was to conduct negotiations for the second tranche of IMF loan that Russia needed after the default that Yeltsin's government went through. And then in the middle of his flight, Gore called him and informed him that NATO decided to bomb Yugoslavia, Serbia specifically. And Primakov just basically gave an order to turn around right in midair and go back to Moscow. He refused to continue his flight as a sign of protest, that Russia wasn't consulted, that Russia was treated as a minor power that was not only consulted, but wasn't even informed in advance of the bombing of what Russia considered its historical ally. So, to everybody's amazement, when he came back, his rating just skyrocketed. He became extremely popular. This sort of overt action claiming Russia's national status as a great power that had to be consulted was an amazing feat that brought Primakov instant popularity. And it's precisely because of that Yeltsin got scared. Yeltsin got scared because Primakov was a potential candidate for the elections for the presidency in 2000. So a month after that, he was fired. In May 1999, he was fired, and another prime minister, his name was Stepashin, was appointed. Stepashin was from the liberal camp. He later on joined the Yabloko party. And after Stepashin, in August 1999, Vladimir Putin is appointed prime minister. So now we need to explain why Stepashin didn't last and why it was Putin and who Putin was. Vladimir Putin by that time was known in his two capacities. His most immediate capacity was that he was the chief of the Federal Service of Security, which is FSB, which is an organization that came out of the KGB. And this is why many analysts today call his KGB, which is nonsense, because KGB of the 1990s, FSB, really had very little to do with the KGB under Brezhnev. Moreover, he came from the foreign intelligence, not from the domestic service. So his whole career, he was in foreign intelligence. And then his credentials in FSB are very important because he had this, patriotic support and backing of people by Primakov. In fact, it was Primakov who promoted him and recommended him for appointment, and he was chosen. The second credential that really put Putin in a very favorable rating was that he was from St. Petersburg, and in the 1990s, St. Petersburg was run by Mr. Sobchak, who had impeccable credentials as a liberal and a reformer and a promoter of all kinds of liberal democratic reforms. So coming as an associate of Sobchak, Putin had fantastic credentials as a follower of reform course and of the privatization, and no coming back to the communist past. So these are two very important credentials that he had. But there is more, and this is let's discuss that now. Now, the family and Yeltsin were very worried about the year 2000 presidential elections, because Yeltsin was very sick. He physically couldn't run for another term. He barely made it up to now. Now, he was always drunk and always sick. And what the family is worried about, most of all, is their assets. They're very worried that if a communist delegate were elected to presidency, as he actually was in 1996, which was the so-called stolen elections, they were afraid that there'd be reconsideration of the privatization, and they would lose all these millions and billions that they had. So they had to have a person who was going to be elected president, who is going to keep there. And the communists didn't oppose him because he was not in the Yeltsin's entourage. He was not associated with the clan and with everything. He was an outsider from St. Petersburg. And so this is why he was nominated prime minister, appointed prime minister, because nobody objected to him. He represented this compromise between the family, the conservative statists, and the communists. Now, there are no documents that I can rely on, and nobody ever has seen those, but we can follow the story by simply stating the fact. And the fact is that Yeltsin's family has never been investigated. The stolen assets had never been touched. And so my understanding is this is the cornerstone of the deal that Putin made with Yeltsin's family, that they can keep their assets and that they will be safe, there will be no investigations of anything, and they can keep it. Moreover, I could summarize it even more. So the first deal of the understanding, informal understanding, was that Yeltsin keeps his assets. The second, I think, is that there was some kind of understanding, judging by what happened later, is that there would be no return no reversal of privatization. Everything that happened, they could keep whatever they took. And that is also true up to the present day. Such people as Abramovich and Deripaska, who controls aluminum industry, and Patanin, who controls the huge, biggest in the world, nickel plant in Norilsk. All these people are still there, and they still have everything they got in the 1990s. So from that point of view, Putin kept the word. At the same time, Putin made it very clear that the reforms are going to continue. And what was also pleasing very much to the statists is that the independent foreign policy of Russia that Primakov stood for will continue. So, to sum up, Putin was a compromise candidate that was pleasing to everybody, to the statists, to the communists, and to the family of Yeltsin's clan. Thank you. Don't forget to subscribe.